Edna Longley. It's lovely to be in conversation with you today, discussing Derek Mahon's poetry. It's hard to believe that he is no longer with us. Your friendship with Derek Mahon lasted more than 60 years. You wrote about his work from very early on while he was writing poems at Trinity in the 60s, and you have written some landmark essays on his poetry since that have introduced new generations of poets and scholars and a wider public to his work. What was it that first drew you to Mahon's poetry? What was it about his style and subjects that drew you, and what has kept you interested in and writing about Mahon's poetry since?
Well, reading his poetry, rereading his poetry for this conversation has brought home his death to me more than ever, because I understand more and more fully just what we have lost, and to go back to the very beginning, when I suppose I was beginning as a critic, while Michael and Derek were beginning as poets. I really began to learn then the basis of the trade of a critic of poetry, and I've continued to take my cues as a critic from Michael's poetry, and more remotely from Derek's poetry. So it was an education for me, as well as Michael and Derek serving their mutual apprenticeship as poets. I think what attracted me from the beginning in Derek's work was the power of line and stanza. I'd come from school where I'd done the entrance scholarship for Trinity and really encountered Yeats for the first time, and for me that was a very important epiphany, if you like, about poetry, about modern poetry. And in Derek's way with the stanza and the line, I felt a very profound continuity with Yeats in what he was doing when he was barely 20. And I know that Derek himself has written about the sonorous octaves of Sailing to Byzantium as having inspired him as a schoolboy. And there's another phrase of his about Yeats, which I think applies to Derek's poetry as well. The hissing chemicals inside the well-wrought urn, and I think there he also talks about the Apollonian containing the Dionysiac, and I really think he is writing about himself there when he's supposedly writing about Yeats, and that formal power has been there from the start to the finish. He has been true to line and stanza, I think, in a way which for me rather counters a recent tendency for something called the prose poem, a very loose form of prose poetry, so-called, to be this has become popular, and somewhere else Derek talks about the necessity for there to be the ghost of a song or incantation behind the poetic line, and he's written some of the most memorable lines. I know, like in Courtyards in Delft, the ceiling cradled in a radiant spoon, or in Tractatus, the steam rising wherever the edge may be, or in a disused shed in County Wexford, Indian compounds where the wind dances, you know, and you know, the assonance, the rhythm, the beat, and rather reminded the saying about jazz that don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. Well, from my first encounter with Derek's poetry, it always had that swing.
As you're talking, Edna, I'm reminded of how you have written about rhythm in Mahon's work and the idea of the singing line, and where Mahon and Yeats indeed remind us about the core, the roots of lyric in song, and how that has at various times in the 20th century been rather unfashionable. You know, you've written yourself about a reaction to modernist aesthetics, to imagism, and to a kind of poetry that preserves the music of the line and preserves musicality. I'm curious to ask you more about musicality in Mahon. I think it's Peter MacDonald has written that the musicality in Mahon is an effective counterweight to the sometimes bleak perspectives that we find in Mahon's work. And I'm curious to ask you your thoughts on Mahon's music.
Yes, well, I think the music of his lines and stanzas obviously varies while remaining music. I was thinking about his rhymes. There's another poet who continues to rhyme is Paul Muldoon, and I was thinking that in that Mahon's rhymes are or the effect of his rhymes, that's very, very different from the effect in Muldoon, where rhyme's almost a kind of syntax rather than a form of music, of chime. And it's interesting that in his sadly last collection, Washing Up, that there's Mahon has a translation of Verlaine's poem beginning de la musique avant toute chose, and that poem in that collection almost seems like a reaffirmation that again the ghost of song, that melody has to be there. And there's an elegy for Kieran Carson in the same collection, which is called The True Note, again a musical term, and the poem, I think, conflates Kieran's skills as a musician with his skills as a poet. I'm afraid like fluent skipping song, something like that. And there's a sense of Carson's poetry poised like an archangel above Belfast. And I also think that's a poem perhaps in which Derek Mahon and Kieran Carson come together as poets of this city, though very different kinds of poem they've written in relation to Belfast, but producing, both of them, music.
It's hard to believe that we have lost these two Belfast poets and these two poets of music. It's very sad, and we feel their absence. I suppose another aspect of their form and style that connects them is their interest in the visual arts. And in that poem, that elegy for Kieran, Derek Mahon refers to Still Life, the title of Kieran's wonderful last book. Yes. You have written eloquently about the visual arts being a constant source of value in Mahon's poetry, and I wanted to ask you a bit about that. I mean, in your own writing, you open up the question of ekphrasis beyond simply poems about paintings, to be concerned with the figure of the artist, Mahon sometimes taking up the position of the painter, the space of the studio, various dynamics of the visual arts. And I wanted to ask you a bit about the role you see visual arts playing in Mahon's poetry.
I think when I wrote that essay about poetry and painting, Irish poetry and painting, I didn't even know the word ekphrasis, and that seems to be everywhere. But one thing I'd like to say, I think the tradition of ekphrasis is very strong and very distinctive in Irish poetry, and this goes back to the Yeats family, with which were painters as well as the poet. And I think an ekphrastic poem is certainly going to be a poem which will tell you a lot about the poet's art. It's going to be a very reflexive poem. It's going to be an ars poetica. That's when Yeats writes about Michelangelo, for example. But I think in the case of Derek Mahon, ekphrasis extends in all directions. It is not confined to poems about paintings like Courtyards in Delft or Girls on a Bridge. It's as if his framing of his own poetry it has a very strongly visual element. Obviously, poets represent the senses in various combinations and various emphasis in their own distinctive ways. But I think with Mahon, the visual, particularly the idea of light, not just the object seen, but how it's seen, I think that's really important. And rereading his poems, I was struck by just how much you get the play of light and shadow, various kinds of light, sea light, sea mist, and how often there's a window. The speaker might be looking through a window at horizons, at sky, at water. And this recurs from really beginning to end of his poetry. So I think it's not just that he writes a few poems about particular paintings, but that his sense of the painterly pervades his work, and you do get the sense of him in the later poems written at Kinsale, and poems very conscious of being written at Kinsale, the poets sitting down at the writing table, looking out the window, and which is framing the sea and the horizon. So I think there's something very painterly with a very distinctive light in those poems. And I'm very fond of his much earlier sequence, Light Music, which involves wonderful permutations of those two words, how you might think about those words, as if the poetry is trying to find a music for light, the light in which he sees the world. And one of those poems is called Revelation, quite a biblical title. But it condenses this sense of the importance of the visual, of the vision to Mahon. A colour the fish know, we do not know, so long have we been ashore. When that colour shines in the rainbow, there will be no more sea. And I think that's an extraordinary poem.
Another poet who was important to Mahon, as you've written about, was MacNeice, who also had a painterly sensibility, and whose poems often give us that lens, that frame, the net, the sieve, that sense of the sense of something through which we look to see the world. Can you talk to us a bit about what you see as the continuities and departures in Mahon's poetry from MacNeice, who he loved?
Yes, I think with Mahon you also get an inheritance from Beckett. I think he puts elements of MacNeice and elements of Beckett together, although it's interesting that McNeice, shortly before he died, was reading Beckett and was perhaps absorbing Beckett into some of his own work. So there's a real nexus of Mahon, McNeice and Beckett, which I think should be looked at, and Mahon's appreciation of Beckett's poems as well as of McNeice as well should be put together with his appreciation of McNeice. I think Mahon begins by going back from McNeice to Yeats, or filtering McNeice through Yeats, because McNeice wasn't writing mostly in that kind of Yeatsian 8-line or stanza or long stanza. There's a curious way in which he then, Mahon then seems to go back to the McNeice of the 1930s, who was writing discursively, you know, writing verse, writing autumn journal, writing verse epistles, as Auden was too, obviously. And I think in the Hudson Letter and the Yellow Book, he's there taking often a different way from McNeice. But I also think there was some recognition of a similar sensibility, you know, the autobiographically, psychologically dark side of McNeice. There's I think there was obviously some sense in which that spoke to Mahon's sensibility. So I think it's a mixture of perhaps initially of psychological attraction and then attraction to McNeice's language and imagery. I mean, it's and I suppose in Carradore Churchyard is demonstrating that there is a conjunction of sensibility in that kind of imagery in that poem, which indicates the affinity between McNeice and Mahon, and perhaps that's why Seamus Heaney discarded his poem, because in a sense that couldn't be replicated by anyone else.
To what extent do you think that Protestantism and specifically Anglicanism, I suppose, connects Mahon and McNeice and Beckett? You know, to what extent do they share something of a similar theological sensibility, albeit perhaps an atheist or agnostic one?
Yes, well I think a lot of Irish poetry is still full of what T. Hume calls spilt religion. I think that the fallout of religion continues to course actually productively through Irish poetry, and the reaction against religion, as we know, in modern literature, can produce extraordinary fertile results with writers inventing their own religion, as Yeats more or less did, or David Lawrence did. I think in Mahon's case, there's certainly this recoil against, as you've written very well about this, very interestingly about this, against the Calvinistic element in this society and in Ulster Protestantism, to which he was obviously exposed as a sensitive child, although he was brought up in the Church of Ireland and was a choir boy, and some of his music maybe comes from that. But I think one place where Mahon goes more than McNeice did, and perhaps back to Yeats, was to what was called in the 1890s the religion of art. Again, that was part of the reaction against the loss of loss of religious faith. And I think we do find Derek Mahon writing about art, visual art obviously, but art in general as as a substitute for religion. There's quotation he repeats from Yeats. He actually misquotes it. The phrase, the arts dreaming of the life to come. Yeats's phrase in the 1890s actually, the arts dreaming of things to come. But Derek Mahon repeats this phrase, and I think we can see that happening in his poems. In that poem, Revelation, for example, it is art, it is poetry that's going to produce the vision. And there's one critic of his poetry uses this phrase that about its core being a doomed gesture of appeasement, of extraordinary pathos. You know, there is something very vulnerable, very fragile at the core, which at the same time is trying to attain some extraordinary vision. It's like the mushrooms crowding to a keyhole in a disused shed, or the people watching the snow falling in the snow party. There is some desire for revelation, towards which his poetry is always aspiring in one way or another, I think.
That makes me think of The Forger, to go back to visual arts and the agony and fanaticism that poem documents. But then at the end of the poem, the wish of the forger is for a light to transform the world.
Yes.
So I think you're right about those, you know, you've written so eloquently about those contrary pulls, you know, with Courtyards in Delft. You explore that on the one hand there's an attraction to lambency and radiance and the way that light glistens, and on the other there's a sense of that Protestant zealotry and even warmongering, where the sort of where Ulster is transposed onto these Dutch interiors. And there's a remarkable way in which Mahon's poetry navigates those dynamics, I think, and I think your criticism has illuminated those sort of productive tensions in his work in ways that I find so rich. Is that, I mean, are the visual arts particularly useful to Mahon in that regard, do you think, as a way of working with those kind of contrary elements, if you like?
Well, they seem to be. I think I can almost get a sense from his poetry of what kind of painter he would have been. You know, again, that phrase, is it in the studio poem, the play of light and shadow, or shadow mostly. I see him as a symbolist poet. You know, I think again he comes from the 1890s in that regard as well, and it's no accident he produced a collection called the Yellow Book, and he may be critical of the affectations of that day, but nonetheless that's where he begins. But again, it is only in art, clearly, that he sees it's possible to reconcile the conflicts you've been talking about within himself and within in society. And the visual arts indeed do seem to give him some kind of, again, frame whereby to do that. And it's all about perception, and I know his poetry is always about the perspective from which it's coming, and about vision.
And as you put it, again, going back to Yeats, that exploration of self and anti-self occurs, yes, when he takes up the figure of the artist, and when Van Gogh and so on become a kind of double for him. It allows that exploration.
Yes. Well, the visual arts allow poets to concretize in a way. You can talk about, we talk about image in poetry and image in painting. when Yeats wanted to emphasize his own art in his later poems, he does reach for sculpture, for example, to say as a rhetoric, to say that this poem is as durable and enduring as a sculpture made by Michelangelo, and I think there's that form of emphasis is there throughout Mahon, maybe in certain ways as well. The thing made, the poem made in its concreteness.
But then remade. I mean, should we talk about the revisions?
Well, if you want my... I think Michael has been talking about Mahon's revisions as a form of self-harm. I think that the Derek Mahon who revised his poems is a completely different person from the poet who wrote them. He seems to look at his older poems totally from outside in a very literal and prosaic way. For example, I think he comments somewhere a phrase in a disused shed in County Wexford about the world waltzing in its bowl of cloud. And the prosaic Mahon says, nonsense, the earth revolves, it doesn't waltz, you know, and that's just so blind to the rhythm and the metaphor involved in his original verb. And there was another occasion, this poem is now excised from his oeuvre, I think, but an early poem I'm fond of called My Wicked Uncle, which began, this has been my only funeral, you know. And a few years later, he was still keeping this poem, but he thought, oh gosh, it looks terrible, I've only been to one funeral. So he changed it, this was my first funeral. Now, this is my only funeral. It's a great statement about mortality. This is my first funeral. It's a totally literal-minded statement, autobiographical statement. And he does talk about, you know, the embarrassment of youthful work. So I think it's partly he has felt exposed. He felt exposed by the way he was writing, or what he might have revealed about himself when he was younger. And he even talks about poems like An Unborn Child as, you know, old-fashioned and rhetorical. So I say that this person who revised the poems is not the same person who wrote them, and that's how I think about it. And I think it's extraordinarily important that the original versions of everything are preserved.
The challenge that remains for scholars and editors now to put together the body of work, it's not an easy task. There will probably be a few different philosophies of how that should, that process should. I mean, do you have any preferences or predictions on how Mahon's work will be preserved and remembered?
Well, I hope it's not preserved in some kind of I don't know, maybe theoretically fashionable way, saying all these versions are right and true, and you must, you know, I think absolutely not. You know, so I think we go back to the original form of the poems. Mahon's practice of revision contradicts something Yeats said, which I like, about the difference between prose and poetry. You know, he said that the correction of prose is endless, but a poem comes right with a click, you know, like a box shutting, you know. And even Yeats couldn't revise his poems very well. He's about the best reviser, but still the joins show, as McNeice points out in his book on Yeats. So I don't think a poet can restore well, the inspiration, but also the whole chemistry of when he wrote a poem, what the intangible things that went into the poem in its original state. You can't come back 10 years later and say, oh, change, for instance, in Cardort Churchyard, the phrase reverend trees. It's beautiful, to reticent trees, which he did, you know, and reverent, it takes in so much of everything that's happening in that churchyard. Whereas reticent just means nothing except the trees aren't saying a word, which, you know, it has no reverberation in any direction.
In some ways it feels like criticism is still it's yet to catch up really with just how extraordinary a poet Mahon was, and perhaps particularly on islands other than this one.
Yes.
I'm curious about your predictions for the next 50 years, 100 years, about how Mahon's work will be read, evaluated, interpreted. I'm thinking now of Alva D'Arcy's essay about the meter generation of Mahon's importance for Justin Quinn and David Wheatley, poets like that. It seems to me that his significance for poets like Alan Gillis, for Leontia Flynn, thinking about the visual arts, more recent work by someone like Stephen Sexton, for example, there's so much work to be done on Mahon's enabling legacy, and on how Mahon's legacies have been taken up and interpreted and responded to. I'm curious what you imagine might be the afterlife of Mahon's body of poetry, both in criticism and in poetry.
Well, I think a lot depends on poetry itself having an afterlife. You know, I may be unduly pessimistic, but I see Mahon himself as partly engaged in some kind of rearguard action, some defense of poetry. He calls poetry perhaps the last ditch of sanity, which is very interesting, and feel that this extremely apparently unimportant thing could be the most important thing. But I think that Mahon's poetry is going to survive and have ever-increasing and ever-ramifying influence as long as poetry itself survives. But I think one should pay attention to the warning in his poetry that a poem could be an endangered species too, and we need to look after poetry as Mahon did. So leave it up to your generation to take care of that.
It's hard to believe that Derek Mahon's no longer with us. To conclude, I might just ask you, how will you remember him?
Well, I think I've said reading him for this conversation has really brought him back in a way I'm finding quite hard to deal with. It's made me think about him in personal as well as poetic terms. Like Michael said, I remember him being really funny and really witty, you know, a great companion. So that I think the wit should be emphasised as well as the darkness and pathos. The poetry can be very funny, you know. That poem Matthew 5, for example, it's funny. I think Mahon's a bit like Beckett. You know, you say see all this darkness, but actually, you know, it's incredibly humorous as well. You know, so.
I think that has been one of Mahon's great gifts, that kind of almost gallows humour at times.
Yes,
It's a hard-won humour. Yeah. Well, Edna, there's so many more questions I could ask you, but it's been so lovely to speak with you today, and thank you for your thoughts and insights and your extraordinary criticism about Mahon's work. It's meant so much to me, and I know to so many other people who've been reading Mahon over the years. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Gail.